So today we're going to talk about ingestive behavior. And what do we mean by ingestive behavior? We mean eating and drinking, right? Most people don't think about these as behaviors, but they clearly are behaviors because it's something that you're doing, right? So you are actually going to eat or drink. There are reasons why you would eat or drink. You could probably think of what those might be. For our purposes, we're really going to think about eating and drinking because of a biological need, right? Because you're hungry or because you're thirsty, okay? We're not really going to get into the, I'm eating because I don't think my mother loves me, right? That's a different class. Well, that's for the reason some people eat, right? Okay, we got some head nods, and then some of you are thinking, oh man, that is why I eat. So either you got a laugh out of it or I solved your problem. So either way you go, you came out ahead on that deal. So we're not going to think about necessarily some of the emotional reasons that people eat, although those exist and you should think about those in other places. We're going to think about some of the other sort of reasons that people eat or drink. And for drinking, we're primarily thinking about water. Okay. We do have a whole chapter that we're going to talk about drug abuse, and so we can think about other things you might drink, right, for reasons other than you are thirsty. Okay, so we'll talk about those later. But eating and drinking sounds like fun. We're going to talk about drinking a bit, and then we'll talk about eating. I don't know. We'll see how much time we spend talking about metabolism. I'm going to tell you what I think you need to know so that you can get something out of why we maybe like certain foods over other foods. I don't think we need to go through like the whole, this is the way you break down every single kind of food stuff that you might eat, but you're going to need a little bit of background info to think about these things because it does have important implications for some current day health problems that we're experiencing. I don't know how many of you could think about some of the health problems related to food intake, right? You can list off several. We've got one sort of here, obesity, well, and another, eating disorders. But high blood pressure, diabetes, they're all sorts of issues that spread based on sort of dietary issues. So I think it's important to think about those. We need to think about what starts a meal. I always say those are the appetizers. And then what ends a meal, that's always the check. But for our purposes, we want to think about what are those signals, right, Casey? Those are good ones, right? And we're going to think about some brain mechanisms involved as well this whole time. So it's going to be exciting. All right. So, ingestive behavior, we're thinking about eating or drinking, right? We already sort of established that. We're going to revisit this concept of homeostasis that we've talked about a little bit before. Now, we haven't really spent a whole lot of time on this. We're going to talk about it a little bit. And this is basically where you try to maintain your sort of your internal operating conditions, right, whatever those might be, at some optimal level, okay? And we use these feedback loops to do that. Often we'll think about temperature. Glucose level is one that's going to be important to us today, but we often think about ways that we might sort of maintain this homeostatic balance. And when you think about this, when it comes to, for example, drinking behavior, we're trying to balance fluid levels in your body, right? Okay, because you want that at a certain level. What happens if you have too little fluid? You dehydrate and you die, right? Okay, so watch out for that. What happens if you have too much? You overhydrate and you die, right? So both ways are bad. So don't always think more water is good, because it's not, right? Okay. So you got to have that optimal level of water. Okay. What's interesting, I think, for us is thinking, Zach, how do we know how much water we need, right? How do we make sure we take in that right amount of fluid so we can maintain that balance, right? So those brain mechanisms are cool. The other thing that I think is really awesome about this, how many of you are currently using fluids and or nutrients? Yeah, like all of you, right? But how many of you are currently putting fluids and or nutrients into your body? Like none of you, I can see that, right? Unless you've got like some spout in the bottom of your foot that's like pumping in things, right? You never know, right? Some people. So I'm assuming no one is eating or drinking right now. You're welcome to do that, but don't get them on the chairs. They told me if I damage the chairs this first semester, they'll nothing, but they're nice chairs. If you've had a class in here before, Riley, you know these are an upgrade, right? At least we no longer have the rolly chairs on the stairs, which I always thought was a brilliant idea. Cindy, were you ever in here when we had those? We would have a chair with wheels that don't lock right on the stairs.
There's no way that could go bad.
No,
There's 0 ways.
I know it.
That's 100% safe.
It is. It is. OSHA certified.
Yep.
Perfect.
That's safety safe. Yep.
The only thing that would make it safer is if we let you juggle knives at the same time.
Right.
And in pizza.
See, that's the thing. Before you go up, we just give you one of those pills. You're going to be fine.
There you go.
Yeah. So we want to think about the why are you not eating or drinking right now, even though you're using nutrients and fluids for things. And how do you know when it's time to take more, and how do you know how much to take, right? Let's say you are thirsty. You have gone below your optimal threshold of fluid and you need to rehydrate, okay? Is that a continual process? Do you keep taking in fluid until all of your cells are equally well hydrated? No. You take a big glass, you go, I'm not thirsty anymore. That water in no way has traveled anywhere to help you, right? It's still sitting right there in your gut. But how do you know that I've ingested enough water to stop the intake right now so I don't have to constantly be taking in water, right? I think that's kind of fascinating. We'll think about that. A lot of this is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. We've talked a lot about the hypothalamus lately, right? We talked about it in the reproductive chapter. We talked about it in the emotion chapter. There are, again, going to be hormones that come out of the hypothalamus that go other places that are going to control some of these processes. Briefly, we should talk about feedback loops, because I think it's important to understand how these feedback loops work, right, in general. So there are two kinds of feedback loops. They're what we call positive and negative. And we talked about a positive feedback loop recently. And we talked about that positive feedback loop as it related to a uterus and oxytocin. You guys remember that story? Okay. And we said that works as a positive feedback loop because as soon as you expel whatever's in your uterus, then you can stop, right? Positive feedback loops, however, don't work for things such as temperature. Temperature is sort of the easy one. Okay. If you get a little bit warm, you think, well, I'm too hot. The solution to that is to not become hotter, right? The solution to that is try to cool down. Okay, so you want to kind of adjust your temperature. So you're thinking about when we've got these regulatory mechanisms, these feedback loops, we've always got some variable. Maybe it's oxygen concentration in your blood. Maybe it's temperature. Maybe it's, a variety of things, whatever that is. You can measure that. You figure out what is the optimal point where I want this, right? What is that temperature setting that's great? You need to know if you're above or below that, and then you have to have some sort of mechanisms to move you up or down from your current location so you can get back to that set point. It's that simple. Okay. When we think about a negative feedback loop, which is what we're going to talk about mostly today, this is where whatever effect you're producing, okay, whatever effect is produced, it's actually going to bring you back to that set point, and you can turn off that mechanism, whatever it is, okay? So if the mechanism is you need to be cooler at home, this works, your air conditioner kicks on. As soon as you get back down to that temperature, the AC kicks off until you go back above that, right? That's how that works. It works the opposite direction if it's your furnace. When things get too cool, the heat kicks on, and then it stays on until you reach that set point, that certain temperature, and it stops. In the brain, we might think about these as satiety mechanisms, okay? So satiety just means, you're full. You've got everything you need, right? This is what will tell you to stop eating or stop drinking because your hunger or your thirst has been met, okay? Now, this is a little bit of a lie, again, because why are you hungry? You're hungry because you're at some nutrient deficit, right? That makes some sense, okay? We're going to think about it in those terms. But you're at a nutrient deficit, and so what are you going to do? You're going to walk down to Fat Patty's, you're going to get a cheeseburger, I don't know, right? Sounds good. And you're going to eat that cheeseburger. And guess what happens? You're not hungry anymore, right? Okay. But have those nutrients traveled out of your digestive system? Not at all, right? How long does a cheeseburger stay in your stomach? A couple hours. Yeah, I mean 2 to 4 hours is a good estimate. Everybody runs a little differently, right? Some of you are fast cheeseburger chewers and some of you are slow cheeseburger chewers. It just sort of depends. But when you eat something, it's typically going to stay in your stomach a couple hours. You move into the small intestine, and then you move into the large intestine before you move out of the body. Now, through a good bit of that time, we're going to be absorbing nutrients, we're going to be absorbing water, we're going to be doing the things that we need to do from that food that you've eaten, right? I'm not going to really go into all of the mechanisms on that. But those nutrients have not yet been delivered, even though you no longer feel hungry, right? So there's some other mechanism there that's measuring food intake, right? And one of those is like how full is your stomach, right? And that's kind of an obvious one. If your stomach is empty, then you're probably hungry, right? Because you don't have food coming in. If your stomach is full, then you're probably okay, right? Kind of full. This is the idea behind the, the surgeries where they will remove or kind of block off part of your stomach, right? And so if your stomach is smaller, and then when it gets full with a lesser amount of food, then you're going to feel full sooner, right? And you're going to eat less. Anybody know they call the stomach the little brain? Anybody heard that? No. So there you go, Juwan. That's like new stuff, right? You're going to learn something new today. They call it the little brain because outside of your like central nervous system, right outside of your brain, there are more like synaptic nerve endings in your digestive system than really anywhere else in your body, which is pretty impressive, right? And that makes a lot of sense when you think about like what's the number one thing you have to do to stay alive? Breathe. What's the second thing you got to do? Eat. Yeah, you got to breathe and you got to eat. And breathing's easy. There's not really much to that, right? You just kind of in and out, inflate and deflate your lungs. But eating is very complicated, right? It's a complicated system, so we're going to have a lot of nerve endings there to control that process. Here you go. This is a basic idea of one of these regulatory systems that can control drinking. Basic idea is your body's going to lose water. We'll talk about some different kinds of thirst. You're going to get a little bored with that, but then I'm going to tell you why that's important, so hang in there. So your body's going to lose water. You're going to recognize that you've lost water, and then you're going to start drinking. Okay? Once your stomach fills up with water, it sends information over to the satiety mechanism that says, hey, we've got enough water, we can stop. And guess what? You just shut down that mechanism. What's a bit slower is that water being absorbed into the rest of your body, right? Because if you were to continue to drink until all of your cells had been refilled and hydrated, you would have water just coming out of the top of your esophagus, right? Because you just keep drinking, because it may take hours, right? It takes time to get that water to the rest of your body, okay? This is why, how many of you exercise on a regular basis? Thanks, Adrian, for putting as little effort into that as possible. You're just like... we know that. I get the little sheet that says you do, right? Yeah. So what's a great idea, Juwan, before you exercise is to preload with water, right? You do that? Like a quart of water. That's always a good idea before you do some strenuous exercise. You don't do it? You don't preload a quart of water? You're doing it wrong. No, you try to run light.
Yeah.
Do you know this guy Bernd Heinrich? He wrote that. I'm gonna write his name down.
Okay.
And I'm gonna spell it. He wrote this book called Why We Run. He's got a
I've heard of that book.
yeah, he's got a PhD in biology. He's a physiologist, and then he's got this really weird story. So if you read this book and you think like, I'm gonna figure out why you run, the first like third of the book is autobiography. So his parents like escaped the Nazi invasion in Germany, right? They lived in the wood, like they hid in the woods for years. Then his parents came to the U.S. They basically dumped him and his sister at an orphanage in Maine while they went to Africa to collect bird samples for like Natural History Museum, right, Casey? It's getting to be a crazy story, right? And then, so this guy goes to like one of the University of Maine campuses, right? It's got a different name now than it did then. He gets on their track team, and he's like, he runs, he runs really well. I think he actually did cross country because he did long distances, right? So he's like running, and he was really good, but then he went to graduate school. When he gets to be in his mid-40s, he goes, you know what I should do? Ultra marathons. And so he's like in his mid-40s, and he decides he's going to train, and he ends up winning, like in Chicago, this ultra marathon, like when he's like 45, right? Like outright, not just age category, outright. Okay. He also held the record. I guess I don't know if he holds it or not, for the longest distance anybody has run in 24 hours. So he ran like 156 miles and like 1,100 yards or something in a 24-hour period, which is pretty impressive, right? So I mean, he's just like running. But in the book, he tells you like he studied moths to think about how he should thermoregulate his body while he's running, and then he studied frogs to think about how he should move his legs, and then. So then, like a lot of people who run these ultra marathons, and this is the only reason I would ever be interested in this, you need, while you're running, if you're running like an ultra marathon is like 50 miles or 100 miles, right? If you're going to run this, you need, while you're running, to have some sort of carbohydrate, right? Some sort of nutrients. What's a great carbohydrate that you can get in a liquid form? Beer. So some of these guys will drink beer while they're running. I know, Cindy, right? Isn't this just brilliant? And so I know, right? You might get into this. Like, this is something, right? Because you have to. It's good. It's got a nutrient. You know, it's got so you're okay. You don't want to just drink straight water if you're going to run for.
Also have it like running at the finish line sometimes, like post race.
Yeah.
For like a marathon, like I've done a couple marathons before, and like they have like their own little separate tip, like free beers. For like, yeah, I mean you have to have your ID, of course, but like.
So that's, I just imagine running with my ID out in front of me, straight into the tent.
Instead of like a number, you just have like your blown up ID.
Yeah,
Your
yeah.
birthday on it.
So for these really long distances, they will drink while they're running, right? Like during the stages. But this guy Bernd Heinrich, he had this other idea. He was trying to think of other carbohydrates that he could ingest that might not, because one of the downsides of drinking alcohol is dehydration, right? And so he has to think about what it is. So he has this bright idea. He's going to try cranberry juice. Okay. So you can think about what, for those of you, and I love cranberry juice, right? But for those of you that have ingested a good bit of cranberry juice, what happens? It makes you urinate. So the first time he ran a race, he didn't have any problems, right? He's like, okay, so the next time, though he lost like 15 minutes on his time because he had to take so many bathroom breaks while he was running this race because he kept drinking Ocean Spray. By the way, Ocean Spray sponsored him for that race because they were, because he was drinking Ocean Spray cranberry juice. It's kind of crazy. But Bernd Heinrich, he's an interesting guy. But anyway, you should start preloading with some water. I guess if you're really concerned about your time, which is related to your weight,
Like, I don't like not drink water all day. I do, but just not directly.
not immediately before, you don't just like preload a quart of water. Think that'd make you sick while you're running?
Yes.
Well, try it anyway. It's a good experiment.
I'll give
You-
it a go. The race is Friday.
Better idea. Tell your opponents like that. I know. And then give them one of those pills to take for the airbag.
Yes. Okay. I'll do that.
Gonna make a fortune. All right. Anybody have any questions about this or Bernd Heinrich? It's a fascinating story.
Really?
Yeah. I mean, I was reading the book and I thought, did I get the right book? Because at first I thought the cover was put on the wrong book because it's basically this like escape from Nazi Germany story. And I thought that's really, I mean, he's not running from Nazi Germany. But he kind of says when he was like living in the woods, he would run down this path and he would like watch the bugs fly. And got him excited about biology and stuff. But he was even trying to, like, his gait. He even started working on his gait and his cadence, right? So he had the least amount of drag with his feet. Because again, it's not a sprint, right? If you're running 40 yards, you've got a completely different set of mechanics than if you're running 100 miles. Because you have to be able to run one, you know. And so he's really, I think some of you would find it a really interesting book. And no matter what, he said, no matter, he even tried breathing differently, like how many steps per breath. And he was like, well, no matter what, you should always breathe out 1 step. So your out breath should always just be 1 step, but your in breath could be like 2.5 steps. I don't know. Now you're going to think about this, right? I've totally ruined your race on Friday. You're going to be thinking, like, how many times am I breathing? Do you guys practice that? Yeah. Yeah. How many? What are you, like a 2 to 1 or? Yeah. There you go, right? Now if you just study frog legs, you'll definitely win. He did all kinds of crazy stuff. But, I mean, he obviously worked. Okay, so let's think about drinking a little bit. We'll spend most of our time on eating, but we'll think about drinking a bit. There's some cool things to think about. There are a ton of fluids that you have. Some of the fluids are inside cells. Some of them are outside cells. Then we have some special fluids that are like in your blood vessels or in between cells. It's not a big deal. You need the right amount of fluid in all these places. If you get too much, that's problems. If you get too little, that's problems as well. Okay? So we want to think about something called hypovolemia. Okay? What is hypovolemia? It's when you lose your intravascular fluid. There are a couple ways you can lose your intravascular fluid. Some of those are more painful than others, right? So if someone were to like clip an artery, that's a way that you could start to lose your intravascular fluid. So how many of you have ever, I don't know, been in a sword fight with someone and taken a chop to the leg? Nobody's done that. You guys don't really. Did I ever tell you about the craziest thing that I've ever seen here in the city? So I was once invited, for those of you who know in the history department, I was once invited to this Christmas party they had, which ended up being like a medieval kind of thing at the Episcopal Church, where they made like medieval style dishes, and then there were people like reciting Old English poems. And then at the end of all of this, and this is where I started to wonder what they put in the bread and the homemade mead that I had. There was a guy who jumps out with 2 fanoodles, you know, like like the pool fanoodles, and says, "All right, guys, who wants to have a sword fight?" And then there were people who got out in the middle of this like fellowship hall at the Episcopal Church and started having a sword fight with each other, and it was weird. It's the last time I went to one of their parties. Psych department doesn't have crazy parties like that, do we? We just have regular parties. Yeah. So, you start to lose blood. I'm imagining most of you have had some sort of cut where you've bled, right, Sarah? Whether that was, you know, while you were, I don't know, using your throwing stars. I'm sure you have a bunch of those at home. Occasionally they cut your finger when you pull them out. You were chopping potatoes, right? Things happen. There are a lot of things your vascular system can do, right? Will contract the muscles, make your veins and arteries smaller. You know, try to because the thing you don't want to do is like have your blood pressure drop too low. That's a problem. So you're going to kind of like pinch off things, right? But that has some serious limits, right? So we have real limits on how much space we can save. So we still think we have a full sort of vascular system. And once we've reached those limits, we have to trigger sort of thirst mechanisms, right? What is blood mostly? Plasma, which is mostly water. It's water and some proteins, right? And so it's mostly water. And so if you lose a lot of blood, then you can get thirsty. Not a big deal. There's another kind of thirst called osmometric thirst. Okay? I don't know what's going on with this pen. This happens when you have an increase in osmotic pressure, and I know that sounds kind of confusing. What is osmotic pressure? but it's when you increase osmotic pressure of your interstitial fluid relative to your intracellular fluid. So basically what we mean here is that your cells have lost fluid, okay? And so they're dehydrated, which is kind of interesting, right? So your cells lose fluid, and we have to increase our fluid intake to adjust for that. There are a few organs in the brain, a few places that are going to be involved in this. One is the OVLT. I'm not going to ask you to memorize that Latin name, okay? Because that's a long one. And also the subcortical organ. These guys are going to be involved in measuring your fluid balance, your fluid intake for the thirst issues, okay? There are other brain regions, your anterior cingulate cortex. Now that's involved in some emotional regulation as well, but it's also going to have some components here. How many of you have ever been really thirsty and then you ingested some water and you had some sort of positive emotional feeling from that, right? Yeah, I mean, that's a regular sort of experience, right? And so this mechanism can be triggered through that process. So we already talked about osmometric. Here's volumetric thirst. We talked about that as well. That's when your blood volume drops and you have hypovolemia. Now, I'm not going to go through this whole kind of story about angiotensin and renin. I mean, that's an interesting story. It's a fun story. It's not really going to help us here. So what we just want to think about, though, is when you experience these sort of issues, these reductions in volume, fluid volume, you need to have some mechanism, some place that's going to tell us, hey, we're short, right? And what's a great place if you wanted to measure sort of the contents of your blood? Anybody have a great idea of where that would be in your body? It's the kidneys, right? I mean, how much of your blood goes through the kidneys at any given moment? Probably like 25% of your blood is headed to your kidneys all the time, right? It's going through there. The basic idea of the kidneys is to have that blood come in, pull out the extra things you don't need, put that into urine, and then hopefully you put that into a toilet, right? That's kind of how that process goes. That's why most of the time, if you think about what's in your urine, for those of you that are interested, it's mostly water. Okay, so it's like excess water. Sodium, right? Extra sodium that you have. Okay, so that's why if you've ever ingested your urine, you'll notice it's salty. So that's something you can do. And then the other stuff in there, mostly urea, which is a nitrogenous waste that you don't have to worry about. Now, if you are a diabetic, not only will you have salty urine, you'll also have sweet urine. You have some glucose in there. You get a little sweet and salty. That's great, right? And then if you just want to have like something that's really flavorful, throw in some high blood pressure and you'll have some protein in there, right? So you get a little savory. I know, right? Then they're going to be exciting. So next time you want to know if you have diabetes, don't bother going to the doctor. Just kind of drink some of your own urine, and if it tastes a little sweet, then you know you probably got a problem. That's a true story, Casey. Why do you doubt me on this?
Because they could probably just easily go get like a blood sugar tester, so
They're not going to think about that.
they don't even think about tasting their own.
No, our default is to think about something or urine.
Yeah.
What you're saying?
Yeah. I know you guys.
They used
Huh?
to do. They used to do.
That's what you used to do?
Yeah, they just did. The doctors just took their finger and like baby pee.
There you go. Unless, you know, for the most part, urine's, I mean, it's just sterile. I mean, it's just hot, salty water. I mean, that sounds pretty good, right? No. You can put it in the refrigerator, let it chill a little bit. So urine, why would you have sugar in your urine? Why would you have glucose in your urine? If your blood glucose levels are too high, then you're going to be pulling that extra glucose out. How do you get protein into your urine? If you have high blood pressure, there are holes in the blood vessels, like in the capillaries in your kidneys. That's how it filters out. But if your blood pressure's high, it makes the holes too big. And then what will happen is the big chunks of protein, the albumin, will come out, which is bad because then you'll end up having, like acidosis, and you'll, basically sort of cook yourself from the inside out, which is, it's not fun, right? Yeah, it's not fun at all. So this is the time when I tell you, stop eating at McDonald's, right? Okay? When I tell you, this is why you don't eat high sodium foods, right? Because high sodium foods will jack up your blood pressure. Okay? So you're going to have all of that sodium in your blood. It's going to suck all the water in. It's going to expand your blood vessels beyond capacity. And it's going to end up blowing holes in your kidneys. And then your proteins start leaking out, the proteins that keep you from turning your blood into an acid and corroding your insides. So, low sodium diet. Now that's hard to do, right? Do you know why it's hard to do? And your first surface answer, and this is not a surface answer class. Your surface answer is like, if you're here on campus and I'm thinking, man, I'd love to have something to eat, which I think about this sometimes. Cameron, where can you go to eat? Well, you've definitely got a McDonald's. You got a Wendy's. Poor old Sabatino's went out of business. That was open 3 weeks. Which I went in there once, and basically I got like a hot ham sandwich that my mom would make me. Cindy, did you eat there? Okay. And no offense to anybody who owned any part of that business. I'm not saying it was a bad sandwich. I'm just saying I clearly went in and the guy had Heiner's bread in the back, put a little butter on it, grilled it on a griddle press, and had like some sliced ham and cheese in there. It was not a commercial product. It was definitely I think it even came out wrapped in foil. So if you go the other direction, I don't know. I've not been to Honey Bones. I don't know what they have, so no comment there. But if you go over to the Student Center, you've got what's that? Is it Pizza Hut? Yeah, Pizza Hut. I don't know. And then you have Chick-fil-A. Some other things, right? We're all talking about high sodium content, right? So that's the surface answer. Why is it hard to get away from a high sodium diet? Because we put sodium in everything. But biologically, why is it hard to get away from a high sodium diet? How many of you know that you need sodium? All of you do. Because remember that conversation, Josh, that we had about action potentials? And I said sodium channels, and then I said something about sodium channels, and I probably said something about sodium channels again. So guess what? If you don't have any sodium in your body at all, guess what happens? You die, because you can't even have an action potential. You have to have sodium, right? Salt is typically not something that's been readily available to our species, right? There are even cultures in the past who have used salt as a currency, right? Because salt is hard to get, for the most part. It's not hard to get now, right? We figured out a way to get salt, and we get it all the time, okay? It's the same thing with sugar. How many of you love sugar? Everybody does. You absolutely have to have glucose. We'll talk more about this later. You absolutely have to have glucose to make your brain run. But you don't have to have as much glucose as is in these triple-decker Snickers bars, right? But you have to have some. It's just hard to not have that. All right. So there's my soapbox. Stay off the unhealthy foods, right? Unhealthful foods. That's the correct term for you English folks. If it's unhealthy food, then the food itself is not healthy, not healthful for you, right? Does that make sense, Andre? So there you go. So if you really want to sound like you know what you're talking about, it's unhealthful foods. That means you're eating unhealthful things. You didn't know that, did you? Now you do. That one's important to me. Most of the rest aren't. So basically your kidneys go, hey, you know what? Stuff that's coming through doesn't seem like it's got enough water in there. So what are we going to do? Well, you can dump out one hormone that's going to, cause some changes in other hormones, right? And then that's going to cause you to constrict your blood vessels, retain sodium. Right? So this is thinking about volumetric thirst, so in the vascular system, right, inside the blood vessel. So if we keep the sodium in there, then we're going to suck water into the blood vessels. The worst thing that could happen to you is have a blood pressure of 0. I mean, it's not the worst thing, but it'll definitely kill you, right? So you want to keep your blood pressure more than up so high, right, to a certain level, okay? not too high. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull in the sodium, or keep the sodium, which will pull in the water, and then we'll actually get thirsty. The only other specific thing that you might have is what we call a salt appetite. Salt, in fact, is the only specific appetite that you will have, right? You don't have a specific appetite for another substance, right? But salt you do, because you do need a certain amount of salt, a certain amount of sodium to maintain, what you're trying to do. Again, we get so much of it now; it's easy to do. It's easy to make sure you have enough salt. All right, so here are ways that you can lose water. I think most of you know how this works. Water evaporates, start to lose some volume. You guys probably just sitting around, playing Red Dead Redemption 2 or whatever it is you're doing with your life these days. That hit a few people in the right place, didn't it? How many of you are spending too much time doing that? Yeah, there you go, Riley. Thanks for the hands.
A few weeks before Fallout 76 comes out.
Yeah, I mean, final exam grades are going to be horrible. Yep. Like 2 major game releases in one semester, I know grades are going to be bad. I'm already planning for that. So, just sitting around, you probably lose, I don't know, maybe half a liter of sweat a day, right? Just sitting around. That's not including if you get up and you walk around and you do things, or if you do some physical activity, right? Then you're going to lose more water through sweat. How can we measure this? Well, you've got stretch-sensitive neurons. They're called osmoreceptors. That sounds cool, right? They're measuring osmotic pressure. How much fluid do you have at any given time? And then they can send out those signals. Once they get filled up, then they go, oh, okay, we've apparently got enough water, right? Because the water's flooding into us. And then they can say, hey, stop drinking. You're good to go. Don't worry too much about that. But this is actually pretty important. Okay. Remember when we talked about thirst earlier and we said there was the OVLT and the subfornical organ, and these both are going to be important for detecting types of thirst. 2 different types of thirst, actually. Now, each of these, one's going to detect, subfornical is going to detect volumetric, and the OVLT is going to detect osmometric thirst, okay? Because they're looking for different things, right? Now, what's interesting about both of these guys, we call them circumventricular organs because they actually bypass the blood-brain barrier. You guys remember the blood-brain barrier, right? And basically that kept any contents in the blood from reaching the brain. Now, Jakia, that's a problem. If I just put a hormone into your blood that says I'm thirsty, right? If I don't have a weak spot in that blood-brain barrier, your brain never knows that that's there, right? So, we have to have those weak spots, okay? One of those is the subfornical organ, and the other is the OVLT. Both of these guys project to the median, and that's median preoptic nucleus. Because we talked about the medial preoptic nucleus the other day. We talked about male sexual behavior. But the median preoptic nucleus. Now the end result's going to be the same. Drinking's the same. Do you drink differently if it's osmometric or volumetric thirst? No, it's the same. The solution's the same, right, Zach? Put in some water, okay? Doesn't matter why, put it in. Now we need 2 different detectors because there are 2 different reasons you can be thirsty, but we only need one output, right? So we only need the median preoptic nucleus to say, idiot, drink some water. So that's pretty cool, right? So you guys just thought the area postrema was the only circumventricular organ that was fun. That's the one that makes you projectile vomit. But we've got these 2 other guys as well, the subfornical organ and the OVLT. Does that make sense? I will ask you about this. Yeah, there you go, Andre. Just make a note. I will ask you about this circumventricular organ business because it's an interesting and extremely valuable exception to the blood-brain barrier story, right? And the blood-brain barrier is a very important phenomenon. It's a very important feature of your brain that keeps you alive. But you need these subfornical, the subfornical organ, the OVLT, to detect thirst. So you have to bypass that. Okay. The pin died. I have to go back to the laser pointer. All right, so there we go. You've got osmoreceptors. They initiate drinking. Not a big deal. All of it ends up going back to the median preoptic nucleus. These kidney hormones do not pass the blood-brain barrier. That's why we have to have those two organs outside of the blood-brain barrier to detect those hormones that are telling us, hey, you're short on body fluids, you need to fix that. How do we know that works? You can actually destroy your subfornical organ, and guess what? You don't drink anymore. That's not a good thing, so don't go home and try that. Not a big deal. I think this diagram is probably the best to describe this. This is your blood-brain barrier. Now just imagine that continues, right? And sort of wraps the rest of your brain, but leaves your subfornical organ and your OVLT outside of that. Remember, your subfornical organ is looking for those hormones from your kidneys to indicate osmometric thirst. The OVLT is measuring the concentration, the solute concentration of your blood. If the fluid levels drop too low, right, then your solute concentration is going to change, and we can detect osmometric thirst that way. Again, the end result is always going to be drinking, and that's coming from activity of the median preoptic nucleus. Any questions about drinking before we move on to eating?
Does that affect, does alcoholism affect like this process?
I mean, that's
Or is that just like something completely different?
yeah, that's going to be something. Largely, that's going to be something different. Most people don't become alcoholics because they're thirsty. It's the effects of the alcohol. We'll talk about that when we get to drug abuse and talk about the effects of alcohol. That's not to say that drinking alcohol doesn't have effects on you, and in particular, dehydration is an issue if you only drink alcohol, right? And so you can have some problems there if you're, instead of drinking some water while you're drinking alcohol, you can really have some serious problems the following morning. I don't know if anybody's experienced that before. So JP, one of the ways to avoid that is do like a 1-to-1, right? Glass of water, glass of beer, right? And that's a great way to be able to wake up the next morning and feel better.
And we can do that until about the fourth beer, and then you start forgetting and very honest.
Yeah, that's why I usually recommend 1 to 2 at a time. Once you hit 4 or 5, then there's some other word for that, some other classification for your type of drinking, right? And that becomes a problem.
Well, sometimes you need to forget things.
Try ketamine. Zach thought that was funny for. No. In all seriousness, and we'll learn why ketamine will make you forget things. They will give folks who are depressed ketamine sometimes as a treatment. I know, right? I think.
Is that with MDMA also?
Yeah, they will do that as well. But right now there are some clinicians who are giving folks with depression ketamine, which seems to work, largely because they have forgotten whatever it was that was making them feel bad.
Forgot everything.
Yeah, I just forgot everything. So
Maybe they started new.
I would not recommend ketamine to solve any problem. There are a few. I take that back. If you need to anesthetize your horse, I would recommend ketamine. Okay, that's a good one. There are not a lot of other great uses for ketamine. The only other real application that you could think like that would actually be a good use for ketamine is there are some battlefield applications for ketamine. And so the reason for that is if you're injured like in a situation like that, but let's say your legs are still good, if you give someone ketamine, and this is why people use it as a date rape drug, if you give someone ketamine, they can still move about, right? They can still move their bodies. They don't know what they're doing, and that's why people use it to take advantage of other people. So you really seriously do need to be careful about that. But if there's an injured soldier, if you give him ketamine, he can still help you, right, like get his body off of the battlefield. And also, because he's forgotten everything that happened, he's less likely to develop PTSD. So they're really like two, in my mind, only like two places I would actually say like, yeah, ketamine's probably not a bad idea. Anywhere else, it's probably a bad idea. It's good if you need to anesthetize your horse or your cat. If you want to anesthetize your cat, I wouldn't recommend doing it at home, under the care of a veterinarian. And then that sort of interesting battlefield application as well seems to be helpful. But there are folks with intractable depression. Nothing else has worked, and they have found that ketamine is successful. Like sort of an interesting, dosing paradigm there. But give them a little bit of ketamine, and they seem to have some significant improvement. Also, sleep deprivation will fix your depression, and I think that's just about as great of a long-term solution as ketamine. I don't think you can do either one of those for very long. But if you're really depressed, stay up for about 3 days, and for some reason you start to feel a little better. True story.
Why is that?
I'm not certain anybody knows, but the ketamine makes sense because it does interfere with your memory process. Sleep deprivation probably does the same thing, because as we talked about when we talked about sleep, we mentioned that during sleep, your hippocampus is busy and doing things, and disrupting that probably has some effect as well. Again, I would not endorse sleep deprivation or ketamine to treat your depression. I'm not a clinician, so I'm not going to endorse anything. But I would recommend seeing a clinician if you guys do have any sort of issues, depression, anxiety, whatever it is. We have a place, I think I've mentioned it before, I'll mention it again, Casey. It's going to be very difficult to find because you have to go upstairs 3 flights to the 4th floor and then walk up and down the hall until you see a sign that says MU Psych Clinic. So if you need that written down, Casey will be happy to provide you written instructions to get there, but it's easy, it's free, confidential. Lots of folks use it. They stay pretty busy up there, right? Let's say they do. So if you're having problems, you can go up there. They will not give you ketamine, nor will they recommend sleep deprivation. Those are things you'll learn about from me, but not them. Do not try to self-medicate your depression with anything, right? That includes alcohol, St. John's wort. People try that one. Also, don't take St. John's wort if you're on an SSRI. That'll kill you. That was not a joke. It'll give you serotonin syndrome, cause you some real problems. Okay. St. John's wort is a dietary supplement you can go buy at health food stores or wherever, but it actually is a sort of a mild selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. So it'll reduce your serotonin levels, and then you're taking an SSRI that's going to increase your serotonin levels, reduces reuptake, and so they're both going to be working in the same direction to give you some problems. It's kind of like overdosing. Well, those are interesting topics I wasn't prepared to talk about, but there you go. Anybody ever seen an animal on ketamine? No, nobody ever worked at a vet. It's a common veterinary anesthetic. Ketamine is, so don't get too worked up if they give your cat ketamine or your dog or something, right? All right, so maybe we should think about eating now. Anybody getting hungry? All right, you're going to be starved by the time we're finished. I'm just going to keep talking about savory meals that have, savory odors wafting up to your nose and so forth. Really try to make people hungry. And then JP over there is just calling up Grubhub, putting in her order.
I'm actually making plans for Taco Tuesday.
We have Grubhub now. I saw a guy, I was at Taste of Asia last night, and I'm coming out, and there's a guy coming out, not of Taste of Asia, but somewhere, I think the donut shop there, and he's got a Grubhub bag and a Grubhub tag on his car. Yeah.
Changed my life forever.
I know. There you go, right?
It's like Taco Bell, Austin's Ice Cream, Roosters is on there.
I can get ice cream and hot wings.
Yeah, it's a bad thing.
Where?
Like the delivery fee's like $7.
Yeah, but it's cheaper than a DUI.
Yeah. By a lot.
So just throwing that out there. Not that I know the going rate for a DUI, Riley, but I'm going to say they're expensive.
Sometimes it's worth $7 not to have to put on pants.
I mean, for most of you guys are like liking alcohol, so you never take it. Pretty sure that you're supposed to.
Oh, there you go. Just do it once.
Yeah.
I just keep
Create a bunch of emails.
You used it a lot here?
No, I used to go to BBU.
Oh, okay. Well, there you go. Now who's excited about Grubhub? Like one person. Great. I have no interest in Grubhub, nor do I get any sort of financial... Just wanted to let you know about that, Sam. I'm not financially tied to Grubhub, okay? So I don't want you to think I'm advertising for them. I'm not. All right, but let's... There's a spider. Let's think about... let's think about eating, right? So first we want to think about metabolism. Okay, so why are we thinking about this? Well, when we eat, guess what we do? Whatever molecules we ingest from other organisms, whether that's plant or animal, we incorporate that into our bodies. So you are literally what you eat. At that molecular level, you are literally what you eat. So if you eat donuts all the time, then you have used whatever molecules are in those donuts to make parts of your body. That's it. If you eat celery, you're using whatever things are in that celery to make your body. Now, what's interesting about this is there are certain things that, not every foodstuff has all of your molecules that you need, right? Doesn't have all of the amino acids that you need, doesn't have all the substances you need. So you have to have a varied diet. That's usually better, right? Try to eat multiple things, different things. Seems to work, okay? So when we take in these molecules from those foodstuffs, we do it, one, to maintain our own organs, and two, to provide energy for our muscles to move and keep our bodies warm, right? So that's kind of the other thing that we do there. Here's a real surprise. To keep your cells alive, you have to have fuel and oxygen. Okay, so you have to breathe and you have to eat. So there you go. That fuel comes from your digestive tract, and it's there, this is a real shocker, because you ate it. I know, right? Nobody knew that one was coming. So here you go. This is your reserves. How many of you realize that you, because we talked about this, right? You're not constantly eating, even though you are constantly using nutrients, right? So again, I don't think anybody's eating right now, as far as I can tell. You're using whatever stored energy you've had in the past, right? And so where are places that we store this energy? Lunchboxes? Yeah, fat, right? Adipose, that's one. You can put some stuff in your liver. You've got some energy stored in your muscles, right? So you've got a few places where you can store this energy. You can draw upon that later as you need it, right, throughout your day. You can use that energy that you've stored. This is a brilliant system, okay? If we did not have an energy storage system, guess what would happen? Every time you wanted to do something, you would have to ingest food, okay? Now, given, Josh, that you're always doing something, like breathing and your heart's always pumping, you would constantly have to be eating, right? So I think that's interesting. This is why when we've talked in the past, we talked about some species have mating seasons, and quite often that mating season is timed to the presence of extra calories in their diet so that they can have the energy to perform those activities, right? And so because you have to have the energy to do the things you need to do. And if you're only eating enough to do what you're doing immediately, you have to constantly be eating, okay? If you're, for example, only eating enough to get you to the next meal, then you're kind of riding the line there, right? If you're eating enough to get you well beyond the next meal, okay, and I don't just mean like 2 meals out, then we start thinking about some health problems, right? Okay. So not a big deal. All right. So you guys know a bit about glucose, I'm certain, right? You guys hear it all the time. How many of you have seen about 800 diabetes medication commercials in the last 5 minutes, right? It's the only reason I like election season is because instead of all those diabetes medicine commercials, I start to see some campaign ads. And then I kind of think, like, I don't do early voting, I just do regular voting because I like to go on election day and they kind of make a big deal out of it. So this is also my moment where I'm saying if you can vote, you should vote, right? Like everybody should vote. Try to vote twice if they'll let you. That's only, right, Cindy, that's only if you're going to vote the way I want you to. If you're going to vote the other direction, don't even bother. That was a joke. Everybody should go out and vote, Casey, okay? So go out and vote and do that. If you've not done that already, I know don't we have a voting station on campus? Wow, they made that so easy for you, Cameron. Put it right in the student center, I believe, right? Somewhere over there by the bookstore, I saw a sign. So you can go vote. So there you go. But I would, like for me, I'm thinking, you know what the biggest incentive would be to get me to do early voting? Is if I went and did my early voting and then I didn't have to watch any more campaign commercials. Because that would get me to vote on the first day possible. And I really think it would really crank up our voter turnout in general. Because I think even people who don't care about voting would go vote so they don't have to watch the commercials anymore. Right, Cindy? I can see that. I can see that happening. So there you go. How many, can I ask how many of you are going to vote? 1, 2, the rest of you fail. That's embarrassing that you didn't raise your hands. Like, yes, I'm going to vote and be proud of that, right? Right, Kate? You let him have it too. That wasn't as forceful as I wanted, but
Go vote.
there you go. That's better. You should go vote. This stuff's serious, folks. You never know. One day, one of you guys might be running for an office. Hope I'm dead. But that could happen, and you want people to turn out and vote for you, right?
Well, if I run for office, I'm going to advertise my brain air back.
Yeah.
So,
There you
like,
go.
I would hope you're not dead. Give me some credit.
Right.
I mean...
Right. I'll even do a campaign commercial for you.
Okay. Good.
I didn't say on which side. So anyway, serious note, folks, go vote. If you've not registered to vote by now, you can't. But we'll catch you the next time. You know, we do one of these elections like every year. It's not always for a big thing, but you should even go vote for the little things, because that's what happens. You get these little people squirreling into your school boards, right? And then what happens to them? They influence all the things that come on up, Andre, and you just don't know what happens. So you got to really take care of it every single spot, right? It's a really powerful thing. It's pretty impressive. So needless to say, I voted every time I could. And actually it was weird the first time I moved away from home and tried to go vote, like not while I was in college because I still voted at home, right? So it was in my home district. But once I got married and moved out, I actually had to go in and show my ID because my cousins had always, my grandmother actually was she worked the election polls for like 51 years. So I know it's an impressively long amount of time. And then, so my cousins always worked the local precinct, so I just went in and voted. I didn't have to show ID since they knew who I was. It was weird moving somewhere else, and it was like you have to like actually say you're a person who lives there. So there you go. Now, how many of you you get a sticker? I thought stickers would, and Instagram, right? Don't they do things on Instagram, like you post on Instagram that you voted? I saw it somewhere. I don't either. All right. Glucose, that's where we started this story. You need glucose so your brain will work, right? Your brain runs on glucose exclusively. So when you eat things that have glucose in it, you've got a couple options. You could use that glucose right then, right? And that's a possibility. The other thing that you might want to do is store that glucose as glycogen, because you might want to hang on to that glucose for later, right? So the next time you're going to eat a meal, you guys are going to go eat dinner, right? Or have dinner brought to you. Right, JP? And so you're going to eat that dinner. It's going to have some glucose in it. You may not need all that glucose right now. What you don't need, let's put it in as glycogen, right? Let's store it up. What helps you store that is the insulin, right? This is why if you have a problem with your insulin, you have a problem taking that glucose and converting it into your long-term storage, right? And then you have this guy called glucagon that'll help you break down that glycogen into those small sugars, right? And those little glucose molecules, kind of snip them off one at a time so that you can use that glucose for things like the Krebs cycle. You guys are really excited about that. But basically, you're going to take that glucose, turn it into ATP, and use it for energy in your cells. So that's pretty cool, right? Anybody excited about that? Some people. It's cool.
I always get excited about fun stuff.
Yeah, it's exciting, right? I should make you guys like be able to draw the structure of glucose. That'd be fun, right? No, nobody wants to do that. My favorite sugar is galactose. I don't know why, but it's got like two horns that come up. It's got a cool name, right? Galactose. I mean, if you're going to be a sugar, be that one. I mean, you know, fructose and sucrose, those aren't that exciting. All right, let's think about some other long-term reservoirs. One of those is going to be, as Andre pointed out, adipose tissue. When we're thinking about the foods we want to eat, we really start to think about how much energy can we derive from these molecules, right? And so when we start to think about foods, we definitely know we want glucose because we've said we need that for our brains to operate. But there's another sort of food source that is also extremely powerful, and those are your, like fatty foods, right? And the reason for that is you actually get more energy, like per gram, out of fats per gram than you would other food sources, right? So this is another reason why that cheeseburger at Fat Patty's is so appealing to you, right? Whereas the salads from anywhere are not, right? Because, again, why would I spend my time eating a salad where I'm getting so little energy, where I can eat this cheeseburger and I get so much energy? Now, for those of us who can eat a cheeseburger for every single meal, every single day, because a cheeseburger is constantly available to you, right? And in fact, if you were to think about other foods that you could eat, a cheeseburger is a relatively cheap option, right? So it's high in fat, it's high in sodium, right? It's got the things that you need, right? And maybe you got some carbohydrates in there with the bread, right? So cheeseburger's a perfect meal, right? It's not a perfect meal every single day, multiple times a day, right? That can cause problems. Now, when we were a species before we invented the cheeseburger, right? And believe me, those were dark days before the cheeseburger was invented. But if we go back a few millennia and we think about our species, what was the fattiest thing we could get our hands on? Like a gazelle, right? Okay, that's pretty lean. And how many of those are we getting? Not 3 a day, right? You might get one. You got to share that with your whole group, right? So your meat content's not going to be that high. You're not really getting anything sugary or sweet. Fruits are the sweetest things that you're going to be able to get your hands on. You're not getting these candies. You're not getting beverages that are sugary. You're not getting cakes, right? I know those were dark days too before the cake was invented, right? Casey, you don't want to go back to there. No. I've always lived in a... You ever think about that? Like, I've always lived in an environment where we've had cake. Like, what does that do to you? In your outlook on life?
I'm thinking about it now.
You're thinking about it now. You should, right? Think about these things. I had this epiphany the other day. Like, I've never lived in a like a pre-Einsteinian world, which I thought was kind of interesting. Like some people there for a long time it was just like Newtonian physics. And then all of a sudden, like Einstein came along, and you may know someone who was like at that transition, right? It's mind blowing. Nobody else found that fascinating, but I did. So, why are fats so appealing to us? We get so much more energy from them. And if we are a species, as we are, that evolved in an environment where food sources were not always readily available, we had to take the best available food source that we had, right? And sometimes now that makes us make choices that are not the best, right? Because we're naturally inclined to the fatty, to the sugary foods, right? Whereas in the past, we didn't have access to those all the time, and so we were able to avoid some of the health problems that we have now that are related to food intake. We talked about diabetes, high blood pressure, obesity. Those are sort of the big ones, right? All right. So you've got a fasting phase and an absorptive phase. Not a big deal. The fasting phase is basically when you don't have nutrients coming from your digestive system. You're pulling them from elsewhere, those long-term storage reservoirs. The absorptive phase is when you're actually absorbing nutrients from your digestive system. So you've got some food in there and you're pulling that out, right? Here's a nice little diagram showing you some pathways for things. Again, keep in mind that only glucose runs your brain, whether that's glucose from the food you're eating at that moment, or it's glucose that you're pulling out from other places, okay, and processing that for consumption. Now, your muscles will run on glucose if you've got some glucose in there immediately. They also need amino acids for protein synthesis, right? So this is why you don't have to answer this, but anybody here a vegetarian or a vegan? Again, you didn't have to answer, so some of you may be and you just didn't raise your hand. This is why they will often take protein supplements, right? Because you need to get certain amino acids that are not available readily from vegetable sources only. Okay? So that's why I would recommend, if you're going to do a vegetarian or vegan diet, do some research on that to make sure you're getting the nutrients that you need, right? If you're going to do a non-vegetarian or non-vegan diet, do some research on that so you're making sure that you get the nutrients that you need, right? So basically, if you're going to eat, I would recommend you do some research on that to make sure you get the nutrients that you need. Does that make sense, Jakia? Have you ever thought about that? You haven't, have you? Just eat, right? It's like something that comes naturally to you, right? And you're just like, well, I'm just going to eat because that's what I do. You go to the grocery store and you go, well, that looks good. And you put it in your cart, you go home, you cook it, you eat it. You don't really think about it very much. Why did I choose that item? And I'm not getting into the like, wow, it had like, a cool little prize in the cereal sort of marketing issues, but from a molecular level to your biological needs, why did you choose that particular product? And it's a tough choice, right? How many of you have, you don't have to answer this, how many of you have ever tried to change your diet or lose weight? Yeah, Juwan, that's tough, right? I mean, it is, because, again, I'm going to mention it another time, even though, again, I don't have any interest in that particular establishment. Fat Patty's is right down the road, right? And so you're going to think, it's tough if you're walking from here to the Rec, right? And you got to walk by there and you got to smell the fries and the burgers, and you're thinking, I'm going to go into the Rec and I'm going to exercise, or I could go over here and have a pint and a burger. And which is easier to do? It's the pint and the burger, trust me. I've done both, so I know, right? I can tell you which way is easier to go. And once you get going down one path or the other, then so you still have to make that conscious decision, right? You don't have to make a conscious decision to eat. That happens. You have to make a conscious decision to do other things. That becomes difficult. So it's a real challenge. And I say that to any of you who are struggling right now to try to maintain a healthy life and diet, because it is difficult, right? And I think you get discouraged about that and you think, oh, there's something wrong with me because I keep trying to eat ice cream on top of my cheeseburger, right? Which sounds like the ice cream would melt. I wouldn't recommend that. And so you start thinking about that and you think, well, why? And then you realize, well, it's a biological reason. And I think once you know that, maybe you can feel like you have better control over it. I don't know. At least it doesn't reflect poorly on you and your choices, right? You think, well, I'm just really bad at making decisions. No. Your body just says, hey, I get more energy out of fat than I do anything else, and my brain needs glucose. So I'm going to eat those foods instead of something else. I mean, who loves celery? Nobody. Nobody. When I ask who loves celery, you go, yeah, with peanut butter and raisins on it. That's not celery. That's a spoon. That's different. When you're like just eating celery, nobody likes that. Even the people who do it, right? And they say like, oh, I love, watch this. No, they don't. They're lying to you. Huh? It is, right? You just reach right in there and scrub stuff out. And you can just throw the celery away. Because it comes in the long stalks, right? So you can just reach right back in there on your palate and clean that off. Celery. You know the problem with celery? There are only 2 people at my house. And so I go in and I buy like a bag of celery, and I can eat half of it before the rest of it goes bad. And I'm constantly throwing away half a bag of celery. That's horrible. Anybody want to go on a celery like go in on some celery with me, I'll give you half the bag. 'Cause I'm just getting tired of throwing it away. I think I need to go find a neighbor who likes celery just every day. Just like half my celery. You guys have those problems? Huh? You don't buy celery? Yeah, I don't blame you. I'd rather not, but
You need to find a rabbit outside.
find a rabbit. Ah.
Oh yeah, because you don't want kids, so you can just get a little rabbit.
I don't really want a rabbit either.
Oh.
Because I had to cut my
Happy medium.
I had to cut my grass the other day, and we have this. I'd say it's an empty lot next to me, but that really makes it sound bad. In fact, it's just like it is an empty lot. In fact, but it's just grass, and there used to be trees. Somebody cut it down. Anyway, it's not bad. It's just a grassy lot that someone else owns and maintains, other than me, right? And there are other, but it's kind of where we live is not really. It's in the city, but not really in the city. And so there are always these like 10 deer who come through every night. It's not really a problem to me. They eat my landscaping, so I'm just not putting any back in because they eat they just come through and just destroy things. But it was really unpleasant when I cut my grass yesterday because I found, Cindy knows what I'm talking about, right? I found some leftovers. It wasn't celery. I don't think it was ever celery, but it definitely wasn't celery when I saw it. So I don't think I want rabbits. Because they're not going to scare away the deer. I mean, I don't want to scare them away completely, just out of the part where I have to walk. And I want to put up a fence, because that seems like work. All right. How many of you are hungry? Yeah, Riley. Guess what? It's because you have this peptide hormone called ghrelin, right? It's released by your stomach, and it makes you want to eat. Okay? It's kind of cool. There are also some neurons in your brain that will produce ghrelin, but ghrelin is this guy coming out of your stomach that is going to signal to you that it's time for you to eat. And there's actually, here's the basic idea. Comes out of the stomach, goes into your blood vessels. From your blood vessels, it goes up to the hypothalamus, signals to your hypothalamus, hey, I should probably start eating, right? It's time to eat. What's interesting is sort of mapping the ghrelin concentration in your blood plasma as you go throughout the day. So you wake up and you notice as you're going from the time you wake up, I don't know how early this person gets up, that they've been up that long before 8 o'clock, right? I know it's none of you. Assuming most of you don't get up until somewhere in this range, since you have evening classes. Cameron, are you up early? 5:30. Wow. That's early. I mean, that's really early. I'm occasionally up at 5:30 if I've not gone to bed yet. But I never have been to sleep and then get up at 5:30. That seems difficult. So you get up, ghrelin levels are going to peak. Guess what you do? You eat breakfast, right? You get a bowl of Lucky Charms or whatever it is you guys eat for breakfast. And then your ghrelin levels drop down for a while, right? And they stay down for a while because you've got stuff in your stomach for a few hours. And then your ghrelin levels start to go back up until you go eat your lunch. Probably you guys have like a bowl of Lucky Charms or something for lunch. I think that's what you eat. And then it's going to drop back down. And then it's going to go back up at dinner time and then go back down. And then it starts to creep up a little bit toward the nighttime as well. What's the number one thing they tell you to do if you want to lose weight? Stop eating late at night, right? Which may not be the most nuanced advice, right? Because there are some things you can eat at night. You probably should, depending on what you're eating and other things that you're doing, right? I think eating at night's not the only reason you're not dropping weight. But how many of you have tried that plan? Like, oh, I'm not going to eat at night. Yeah, I mean, probably everybody has at some point, right? It's not fun. It's not fun because you get hungry at night. And going to sleep hungry is not easy to do, right? And the reason that happens is your ghrelin levels start to creep back up as you go to sleep. And, or as you're getting towards sleep, and then that starts to make you hungry again. That's pretty cool, right? So there you go. It's all about ghrelin. Don't worry about this too much, but basically, if your glucose levels get too low, if your fat levels get too low, then we'll start to recognize that, hey, we probably need to eat, right? If you start running low on glucose, okay, your brain gets upset about that. And your brain will start screaming out things like, it's time to eat Fun Dip. Okay? Where's that Grubhub app so I can get some Austin's ice cream? Right? Maybe I'm just going to run into 7-Eleven and steal a Slurpee. You start making poor decisions when you're hungry, right? So stay properly fed. That's the word I was looking for. Don't worry about this. Well, this is actually kind of interesting. So your liver it plays a major role in food, right? We don't typically think about the liver in terms of your behavior, but in terms of your eating behavior, your liver is a central player here. He's a main guy. And the reason for that is there are receptors in the liver for glucose, for lipids. Your liver can break down a lot of glucose and fatty acids, right? We're going to store energy there, so we're going to kind of check and see what do we have? Do we have enough storage or not? You know, things that are going on. We're going to break down and move things from one place to the other. So your liver's highly involved here. I think if you were to ask most people, like, rank the top, 5 organs when it comes to modulating your behavior, I don't think the liver typically cracks that, right? I think they go brain, maybe people list some sex organs, and then they kind of run out of things to say, right? But the liver deserves to be right up there. It's an important guy. So be nice to your liver. That's good advice, right? What are ways you can be nice to your liver? Don't take much Tylenol, right? Stay off the Tylenol. I'm not going to tell you to stay off the beer. I think that's a waste of my time. But cut back on the Tylenol. That'll help you. This is a real shocker. Regulating body weight is balancing your food intake and your energy expenditure. I know, right? Nobody ever thought about that. Like, if you just want to regulate your body weight, eat as much as you do. If you want to lose weight, then do a little more than you eat. If you want to gain weight, eat a little more than you do, right? It's a simple formula. Seems like I should sell that, right? We'll put that, we've got a weight regulation, Adriana, we got a weight regulation program as well as the airbag for the brain. It's that simple. It is. It's brand new. I'll even wear a lab coat when I tell people about it. You see those people on TV and they wear a lab coat and you're like, oh, that's real. And then at the bottom it's just like, this is an actor. It's like, what's that guy know? He just put on a lab coat. It makes him look. They do it on the, I love when they do it on the Exxon Mobil commercials, right? So some of you are a little young to remember that giant oil tanker, right? Right? You guys, some of you know what I'm talking about. You learned about it in your history class. Some of us, Cindy, we won't say who, may have some vague or less than vague memory of that event, right? And so you can think about some of that impact, right? And then they'll put a guy in this like crisp white lab coat on an Exxon Mobil commercial, like oil and gas isn't dirty, guys. I got a white lab coat on, trust me. And you're like, I know oil's dirty. I've seen it, right? And I don't mean dirty in like I'm not making a political statement. I'm just like, it's oil, right? And it's gas. So there you go. Right? If they tell you not to drink it or not to breathe it, it's probably not good. Right? That's what they tell you with gas, at least. Oil, I don't know. They don't have to worry about the fumes too much. Anybody change their own oil in their car? You do? Really? That's impressive. Great job. Do you drink the oil afterward? Okay, that's even better. All right. So there you go, right? Not a big deal. Talked about that. Satiety signals. Don't worry about this. Memory. Oh, so this is actually kind of interesting too, right? How many of you are not hungry right now? Okay. So you're not hungry. But what will happen sometimes when you get in the car and you drive home? Suddenly, you get hungry, right? Why is that? Because sometimes when you go home, that's where you eat, right? And this will even happen. It's kind of weird. You can trick yourself on this, Andre. So, like, let's say you normally eat dinner at 8 o'clock, right? I don't know. That seems like a reasonable time based on when this class ends, right? And I'm assuming you eat the same time every day. But let's say one day you have to go to the store first, right? Or one day you have to stay on campus longer. And then all of a sudden you realize, like, whoa, I'm not hungry and it's 8 o'clock. Why is that, right? Because there are these like context and memory issues, right, as well. You're thinking about the pattern that you're doing every day. So that's something. But there are other things, other sensory signals, right? Appearance makes a big difference. Odor, right? This happens a lot, I'm quite certain, when people walk onto the other end of campus. They're not hungry, and then they smell. Sometimes the odor coming out of fat patties will turn you off from food if you were hungry, right? I've gone through there, and that's happened to me before. Thinking, whoa, I'm going to go get something to eat, and then I'm like, no, I don't think so. That's why if you walk around the back of the building where they have the dumpsters, that helps. Just heads up there. But there are things with the appearance of the food, the odor, the taste, the texture. These are all things, temperature, that can cause you to eat a little bit more. I think one of the important things to think about is not just this is something we've talked about so far, is we've really just talked about the sort of biological molecular issues, but there are also emotional issues, right, when you eat something. How many of you, we've already talked about drinking and having that sort of pleasant experience. There are foods that you eat, right, that have pleasant experiences and memories associated with them. We're getting ready to come up on a holiday associated with food, right? Only associated with food, in fact, which is kind of an interesting holiday, right? I mean, if you guys think about this. I think that's because if we were focusing on sort of the historical aspects of that holiday, it might not be the best thing to celebrate, right? I don't know if you guys are thinking about that or not. I am now. So that's a whole different story. But what about like, how many of you have like a favorite dish that your mother makes for Thanksgiving, right? No, nobody. Casey, do you? No, you don't like Thanksgiving at all?
My dad buys Thanksgiving from Town and Country.
Oh, really? That's interesting.
He can't make anything, so he just buys like boxes.
Oh,
It's really cute,
well, that's good.
and it's awful. So.
Well, it's hopefully about something else, right? So, but a lot of people like pumpkin pie. Anybody like pumpkin pie? Like, that's something, right, Zach? My mom doesn't make pumpkin pies. She makes baklava instead. I know it's like an odd Thanksgiving thing, but I can only convince her that I deserve it at the holidays. Like, she won't make it for me the rest of the year because it's so labor intensive, right? Because you got to think like these like paper thin sheets of dough and like paint butter and honey on them. I don't know. I don't want to know because then she'll think I can do it, and I don't want to put the effort into it. But there's some sort of like when I eat that, there's like some sort of emotional component of that as well, right? So you're eating that pumpkin pie, and you're like, it's not just about the glucose and the fats and the carbohydrates. There's like some other element to that. Yeah, right? And it feels good, right? You're like, oh man, I'm going to get a pumpkin pie, right? So there you go. Who's going home to get pumpkin pie today? Got anybody convinced of a pumpkin pie? No. There you go. Let's see. Hey, how many of you guys have heard about this CCK or PYY? These are actually both hormones. I'm not going to expect you to know a whole lot about this, but they're both hormones that come out of the parts of the small intestine, and they both make you think that you're full, right? And so after you've eaten some food and nutrients are coming through, these hormones get released, and you stop eating, right? You don't have to eat anymore. You're definitely full. No worries. Nothing going on. You're good to go. What's really interesting about this is that you would think, right, like, well, here's an easy solution for overeating. Why don't we just give people injections of these hormones, right? Problem is that doesn't work. That's actually been tried. That was a good idea, right? And you would think, well, if it's just this hormone, let's just do that, right? Easy way to lose weight. You get your CCK or your PYY injections. The problem with eating is, remember that time I told you have to eat to stay alive, right? So it makes a lot of sense, Calvin, to have multiple systems controlling this, right? You don't want just one system in control of eating, because if that system were to break down, guess what happens? You die. And you don't want to die, for the most part, right? I think that's sort of the idea, right, behind life, is not dying, right? I mean, it's implied in the word life is not dying, right? And so what happens is when you would maybe one system would break down, and then you'd have to have other systems to keep you eating so you stay alive. And so just injecting these hormones doesn't seem to have any effect on that. Now, there was an interesting study a number of years ago how they figured out like CCK actually works. There were some folks who they were doing this study in rats, and so they had some rats, and they were preventing them from releasing CCK. Now, if you do this, if you prevent them from releasing CCK, they will start to overeat, right? Which makes some sense. What was interesting is they had these rats, and they were, blocking their CCK signaling, right? But what they noticed is they didn't gain any weight, right? And they compared them to these control rats. And they're like, why aren't these rats gaining any weight? And then they thought, let's think about this for a minute. And they started looking at the rats and what the rats were doing. And what they noticed is the rats who had their CCK blocked were actually spending more time on their rat wheel. And so they were running longer and expending more energy to compensate for eating more food so they could maintain a body weight. And so then the next study that they did, they took away the wheels so the rats couldn't get their extra exercise. And then they noticed that, if you block CCK, rats gain weight. It's kind of fascinating. The rats found a way to cheat to maintain their body weight where they needed it to be. I don't know, Morgan, that's pretty exciting, right? That's pretty cool. There you go. There's a great picture of a guy in his digestive system. So that looks cool, right? We've talked about everything there. You guys can go back and take a look at that if you want. Here it is showing you the effect of PYY on hunger. So there is some, this is in a buffet 30 minutes after they received that injection. So there is a small dip, but there's not a huge dip in their intake, and it wasn't enough to actually cause any sort of, long-term, there's not any benefit to taking those hormones. All right, so we've talked about what starts a meal. Let's talk about what stops a meal, all right? A lot of this happens because the liver finally gets nutrients. And once the liver gets nutrients, then we know, hey, we're good to go, right? Because the liver is the first organ that's actually going to get those nutrients coming out of the small intestine, right? It's the first place we send things is to the liver, okay? So once the liver goes, hey, I'm getting nutrients, it can start shutting down those eating mechanisms in the brain. So that's kind of exciting, right? Remember that liver, so important, okay? Sort of, if we're thinking about insulin again, like why is insulin so important? We already talked about that conversion of glucose to glycogen for long-term storage. On top of that, insulin seems to be responsible for letting you know that you're in the absorptive phase, right, of metabolism. And if you're in the absorptive phase of metabolism, then you don't need to eat more, right? Because you've already got food in your digestive system, so you don't need to eat. So the presence of insulin indicates, hey, I've got nutrients, I've got food, I'm pulling those nutrients out, I don't need to eat anymore. So you get it also serves as a satiety signal. So that's kind of exciting, right? Hey, who remembers when we talked about kisspeptin a couple weeks ago? We said that was a hormone that controlled the onset of puberty, and we said that was under the control of this guy leptin, right? Now what's interesting about leptin is, again, it's coming out of adipose tissue. So the more adipose tissue you have, the more leptin you have, right? And leptin is actually an indicator, again, that you don't need to eat anymore, right? Because once you've stored enough adipose tissue to kind of make it through, some sort of extended time, you don't need to do that anymore. There was actually a strain of mouse. This is one way that we've studied a lot of the sort of eating mechanisms. Is one's called the OB mouse. What's interesting about this mouse is it was a knockout mouse because they mutated the genes that produce leptin. So this mouse had difficulty producing leptin. Even though it would continue to produce adipose tissue, the adipose tissue would not release leptin. Okay? Don't worry about this too much. But there's an image. You can guess which one is the mouse that has the problem with leptin. right? That's the much larger mouse. These are both the same species of mouse, so they should be the same size, right? They're age matched. It's not, it's not two different strains of mice or anything. Although one of them does have the, or species, one of them does have the leptin gene knocked out. Well, actually, they both do. This one had the leptin gene knocked out and nothing happened. This guy had the leptin gene knocked out and they gave him doses of leptin. So if you take doses of leptin, it seems like that can reduce your food intake. There are some brain mechanisms we should talk about as well. If we disconnect parts of your brain, that can affect your food intake, right? Ingestive behaviors are mostly controlled, or a number of them are controlled by hindbrain mechanisms, right? So if you cut that, then you can see what happens. What's interesting after some of these studies is that if you destroy the lateral hypothalamus, then animals will stop eating or drinking, right? And so the lateral hypothalamus is responsible for indicating that that you should eat. And in fact, if you stimulate the lateral hypothalamus, animals will start to eat and drink. Okay, so it's that lateral hypothalamus that causes that to happen. The ventromedial hypothalamus does the opposite, right? And so if you were to destroy the ventromedial hypothalamus, then you actually start to see where these animals will eat more, so they'll overeat, right? And then if you stimulate the ventromedial hypothalamus, they stop eating, right? So there you go. There's another great weight loss plan. We'll just start stimulating your hypothalamus. That doesn't seem like a great idea, right? Nobody wants a brain surgery to cut back on their food intake.
Does the lateral hypothalamus on both sides?
No, well, the hypothalamus is two, right? So it's the left and right is lateral. There's just the hypothalamus itself is like 30 different nuclei, right? And so the lateral hypothalamus is the part way out to the side of one side, but there's going to be one on the other side. Yeah, there's one on both sides. The same as with the ventromedial, it's going to be at the bottom in the middle, but there's one on both sides. Does that make sense? So there you go. You can actually see all of these different colored dots, Andre. Those are different brain nuclei in the hypothalamus itself. But they're all kinds of different places. Remember we talked about the suprachiasmatic nucleus. We've talked about some other things in the hypothalamus as well. So not a big deal. Okay. And here's your lateral hypothalamus. And there are those orexin neurons again. You guys remember those orexin neurons from sleep, right? So they're going to be involved here as well in that lateral hypothalamus. There are some other molecules that we could talk about. One of those that might draw your interest are these endo cannabinoids, right? So there are two types of cannabinoids. There's what we call the endo cannabinoids. These are the ones your body makes. The other are called phytocannabinoids. Those are the ones you get from plants, right? I don't know if you guys are familiar with those phytocannabinoids or not. You can find those on the internet if you're curious. But mostly they're coming out of the marijuana plant, right? In case anybody wasn't, just in case, Casey, nobody was up on that. Cannabinoids. This is why. What's one of the sort of unintentional side effects of marijuana use? We kind of think of it as a stereotypical thing. Yeah, hunger, right? Yeah, but it's real, right? It's actually a real sort of issue, right? Are the the notorious munchies, right? If you use marijuana, so that's actually sort of real. Endocannabinoids have a major effect on your digestive system. Not only are they not only do you have receptors for these in your brain, but you have them in your digestive system as well, right? And those are probably responsible for the hunger involved in this. Now, that's great in a lot of ways because we can give cannabinoids to individuals who have trouble gaining or maintaining weight or eating, right? So if you think about folks who have terminal disorders that are affecting their food intake, they have wasting disease, things like that, you can give them, this is a sort of another medical application for marijuana, is to give them that so that will stimulate their appetite. So it's pretty cool, right?
Is that where the term cannabis came from?
Yeah, it's just cannabis is a cannabinoid. I mean, it's that's the species name of the plant, and then the cannabinoids are just molecules from that plant, or molecules that you make in your body that because the plant was named first, actually, that you that are similar, and they both work on the same receptors, right? We'll talk a little bit more about that in detail when we get to the drug chapter, but in general, that's how that works. On the flip side, you can actually, block these, right? And so you can give folks things that will decrease their appetite by manipulating their cannabinoid receptors. That's kind of exciting, right?
I have the absolute best story about using marijuana to increase hunger and someone was ill.
Really? Do you want to share it?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
I always share it 201, so I don't think I'm going to My mom, when I was a kid in the 90s, had lung cancer, like really like terminal lung cancer, and she was having to undergo a lot of chemotherapy, and she wouldn't eat because she just couldn't. She was always nauseous, and so her doctor was like, "Look, I can't straight tell you to go get marijuana, but I'm straight telling you to go find yourself some marijuana and smoke it and give it a shot." And so she went to my sister. My sister's like the procurer of all illegal things, and they smoked weed on my front porch at my dad's house. And my mom was a very Christian woman, like very involved in the church and stuff like that. And while she was smoking with my sister and my sister's husband, her prayer group pulled up the hill. And supposedly my sister said my mom was really like giggly when she would smoke, so like she had to sit through an entire prayer group meeting, high as hell. But she ate, and that was what mattered. So, and that's my favorite story about using marijuana.
That's a winner. There you go. It works.
It did.
I mean, it does. Yeah.
She ate like a Big Mac that day. My sister said, like consumed it.
Wow. So there you go. That's a good one, Casey. All right. I don't know if we need to talk any more about endocannabinoids. We'll talk again more about those later. But they do stimulate your appetite. Hypothalamus, we talked about that. We talked about leptin. I'm not going to ask you about these sort of specific issues. We should talk a little bit about obesity, given that it's related to food intake, and given the sort of issues with this and the increase over the last couple decades. And there are a lot of social, I think, factors used to explain this, right? One of my favorites is to blame Capri Sun. I don't know how many of you guys still drink Capri Sun. Is that a thing people drink? No? It was big when I was like 10. Right? You guys all drink it when you were 10? Okay. The problem with that is a lot of these, like what they call convenience foods, right? So they started developing a lot of these convenience foods in the 70s and 80s as more and more families had to become two-earner families, right? Because it was, if both of your parents were working, one of them was not probably available to make all of these meals, and so things like Lunchables. How many of you guys still eat Lunchables? I know that's something somebody still eats. I see adults walking. Yeah, I know. I see you guys at the store loading up on. So these kind of convenience foods became very popular during that time. Originally, they were designed for like once a week, right? Like once a week, have your Capri Sun and your Lunchable as a little treat while you're watching your Saturday morning cartoons, right? But when that becomes your meal every day, over time, that becomes a real problem, right? Because they have high fat content, they have high sugar content, they have high sodium content, and you start to eat these things on a regular basis, and so that becomes a problem. However, again, there's that biological underpinning to that. Those things are very good to eat, right? I mean, everybody likes eating them. They taste good. Nobody turns down a Lunchable, right, if it's offered. Nobody's going to turn down these sweet, sugary beverages. So that's been one contributing factor. Physical activities kind of dropped off. That's been more of a, I think, an issue with the adult population as jobs have changed and so forth. I think hopefully we're in a bit of a corrective measure with kids. It seems like kids have a lot more sports activities that are available to them now than they had when I was younger, which was not that long ago, in case you just were curious about that. Just wanted to correct in case anybody thought I was really old. Just wanted to make sure. Yeah. So I think that's a little bit of a corrective measure. I'd like to see where that goes. But I think one of the things that's really interesting that's not in your book is there's this group in France that's really been looking at sort of the effects of high-fat diets and brain development, right? Which is really kind of something to think about. If you think about kids eating these high-fat diets, what's happening, right? So they got these rats, and they gave a rat mother a high-fat diet, right, while she was pregnant and nursing. So that provided a high-fat diet to her offspring. They took those offspring, and then later they gave them amphetamine, which is, seems reasonable, right? What was interesting when they gave them amphetamine is their brains responded as if they were rats that had been addicted to amphetamine, right? And later we're going to talk, when we talk about drug addiction, an area called the ventral tegmental area and the nucleus accumbens, right? This is kind of that important brain circuit for addiction and addictive behaviors. That brain region in these rats that were fed that high-fat diet during development was the same as if that rat had been addicted to drugs, right? And so they kind of had that same kind of response, which I think is a really fascinating, if you start to think about, I know we always try to think about what are the, I don't know if you guys know this, there's like a drug addiction problem here. It was funny, wasn't it, Cindy? And it seems to be worse here than it is a lot of other places, right? And there are a lot of other reasons for this, right? And I know people like to make arguments about, the types of industries we have here, people taking advantage of the situation, like manufacturers and prescribers and so forth. There are a lot of, contributing factors. But I like to think about, like, what was a major problem here a couple decades ago, right? I mean, you start to think about obesity being a problem. And then I start to wonder about the kids, right? So I start to think about, like, well, what about the brains of the people who are here? Does this same kind of element play with humans, right? And then you've already got people who have brain development set up already, on the average, leaning toward the brain of someone who's been addicted to drugs for a while, just based on that food that they were exposed to as a child. And I don't know. Kind of fascinating, if you ask me. Something to think about. What I'd like to do is do a study and look at places that have drug problems and see if that was preceded by an obesity problem, some decades before, right? And then you can kind of think about this. So somebody should do that and tell me what the results are. It's kind of interesting, right? Yeah. How many of you know your BMI? How many of you know your BMI is probably useless? Right? I mean, it's not really... it works for like 4 people. There are much better ways to determine if you're at a healthy weight or not than just like using a BMI and getting fixated on that, right? So, if we're thinking about, again, some of these factors that lead to obesity, food's cheap, right? It's a lot cheaper for us than it is in a lot of other countries. It's a lot cheaper for us now than it was a lot of centuries ago, right? If you think about, you go back a while and everyone had to grow their own food, that seems like really expensive to me. And not just from like a monetary perspective, but from a human labor perspective. Food right now is fairly cheap. It's convenient. It tastes good. Right? It's very palatable. We know what makes food taste good. How many of you have ever looked at the ingredients in your food and you notice how many artificial flavors are in there, right? Why are there artificial flavors in your food? Do you know why? To make it more palatable, so you'll eat it. Right? If I can come up with a chemical compound that makes this food taste better to you, you'll buy it over somebody else's food, and then I can make more money. Foods are very high calorie now, so we've got a lot of things packed into it, right? So it's high calorie. And we have those convenience foods, and we put sugar in just about everything, right? It's surprising how much sugar and salt are in things that you don't think should have sugar and salt, just because it was there. Spaghetti sauce. Do you know how much sugar's in spaghetti sauce? Why do I need sugar in my spaghetti sauce? I don't know. Doesn't make any sense to me. It's there. Tastes good. So they keep putting it in, right? Questions about that? Again, we talked about these physical activities. If you think about like hunter-gatherer societies, we're definitely spending a lot less energy than that, right? Those of you who raised your hand for Red Dead Redemption 2, right? Definitely spending less calories doing that than you would have been if you were in a hunter-gatherer society, because instead of playing video games, you would have been, making arrows, or out tracking food, or, chopping berries from a tree, or, digging holes to preserve your finds, right? I mean, all of these things. You're going to be doing something other than...
I was going to say, so pretty much everything you do in Red Dead Redemption 2, because you can do almost all that.
Yeah, but calorie expenditure is far less, right? I would say it's like 99% less, right? So if you're like trying to walk across town and you're just doing this, it doesn't really take a lot of calories, right? So there you go. So what you should do instead is you should join those people at Ritter Park who do the LARPing. They spend a lot of calories, at least doing that. I don't know what else they do with their lives. But if you were to dress up in cowboy costumes and just start like walking around town, I wouldn't carry a gun, just as a heads up. But if you were to like walk around town, or you guys could do it at Ritter Park, set up a city and have fun, right? So much more exciting. No, nobody.
Especially with winter coming up, because you can game out in a snowstorm.
Whoa.
So
Yeah,
it would be perfect.
it would be. There you go. Nobody's going to do that. No. Not until they invent Westworld. Then you'll spend a lot of calories. Yep. All right. There are some genetic factors also that will affect your ability to sort of retain energy stores and your metabolism. Not a big deal. I'm not going to ask you a whole lot about that, but things you need to think about. Part of the problem with treating obesity is you can't stop eating, right? So like other things, if you're doing something bad, let's say you're using cocaine, you don't have to use cocaine to live, right? I mean, yeah, you think you do, but then when you stop and you go through withdrawal and you're like, oh, this is horrible, and then once you get past that, then you're like, oh, okay, I really don't have to use cocaine to be alive, right? And so I would take a wild guess that most of you are not using cocaine, just given like what I know about statistics and how many people use cocaine. It's not most of the people in the world, so it's not most of the people in this room, and maybe some of you, but it's not most of you. And those of you that aren't using cocaine are just as alive as the people who are, right? I mean, Haley, that's a reasonable assessment, right? But if I said, hey, how many of you are eating, like, and I don't mean eating right now, but just eating on a regular basis, that's like all of you probably, right? And I said probably because in a couple slides I've got some like eating disorder slides, right? So I'm going to say probably all of you are eating. But if one of you stops eating, you're not going to be nearly as alive as those of us who continue to eat, right? And so treating obesity becomes very similar, or becomes a similar problem. There are some folks who actually think about overeating as a form of addiction, right? Which is sort of interesting on some level. And I think maybe for some folks it works that way, right? You think about the reinforcing. Zach, we already talked about that pumpkin pie, right? And if you get stressed out, something's going on, and your mom says, hey, I'm going to make you a pumpkin pie. And you're like, oh, well, that made me feel good. And so then what do? The next time you're at the store, you buy a pumpkin pie, right? Maybe you start buying a pumpkin pie every week. And you don't need to eat a pumpkin pie every week, right? And so you can see how you can get into these loops, right? Constantly eating pumpkin pies or whatever that food is for you. It could be problematic. That's why you need to find a food that has a high break point. Baklava has a high break point. And a break point is how much effort do you have to put into it to get something out, right? Pumpkin pie, you don't have to put, you can just go buy it at the store. But to get good baklava, you got to have somebody make it who knows what they're doing. I would offer to share with you, but I don't like any of you that much. I'm just going to eat the whole pan that she makes for me. But you have to eat it fast because it goes bad after a couple of days, right? That's how I justify it. Again, there are some similarities with drug addiction, relapse. Some of you may have experienced this, or you know someone who has. Continues to like lose a lot of weight, but then they gain the weight back, and then they lose the weight, and they gain the weight back. And so you think about that as like a sort of a relapse situation. And then obviously stress and anxiety will definitely contribute to that relapse. There are those bariatric surgeries that you can get where they will sort of change the structure of your digestive system a little bit at the upper end around your stomach, right? So that your stomach is going to be smaller. It's going to fill full faster, right? Because to feel like you're full faster and you can lose weight that way. Seems to be effective in some cases. There are some pharmacological approaches. Those, again, the problem is we have so many places we can target. So many hormones, so many receptors, so many molecules that these approaches don't really work very well. Okay? A lot of them have some bad side effects, and some of them can actually prevent digestion, right? So they're actually going to prevent like breaking down those molecules. You have to be careful with that. Sort of one of the best and easiest ways, but also one of the hardest ways in some sense to actually implement are behavioral interventions, right? Like basically just eat less and increase your activity, right? There you go. There's your gastric bypass. Not a big deal. There's some peptides and hormones. You don't really need to think about that too much. I do want to talk about eating disorders briefly. I'm not going to ask you a lot about eating disorders. I think it's important to address them. In particular, I think it's important to say if you're dealing with an eating disorder, you should definitely have somebody help you out with that, right? Because it's definitely not good on your body to continue to do these things, especially those eating disorders that involve like binge eating, where you're eating a whole bunch at once and then not eating a lot later. That can be very problematic. It can cause some long-term damage to your brain, to your other parts of your body. It can definitely be a serious problem for you. I would like to highlight sort of recently the increase in the diagnosis. I don't want to say the increase in the incidence, right? Because I'm not convinced that's true, but the increase in the diagnosis of eating disorders in males, right? And so I think sometimes these things we like to think, well, they manifest differently in males than they do females, and perhaps they do. But males can definitely have eating disorders as well, or other sort of related disorders, and you definitely need to get that checked out. Casey, do we have folks that can help you with this for free? We do. Where are they located? Yeah, just straight up. There are about 3-4 ways you can get up there. There are 2 different elevators and 2 different sets of stairs. And that's not including very creative ways, like scaling the side of the building and breaking in through a window. So that option's available to some of you as well. So, anyway, there are a variety of eating disorders. Again, they probably will not appear on the exam, but I think it's important to think about these eating disorders a bit. You should hopefully cover these a bit more in some of your other courses where you think about things differently. Again, these are very difficult to treat, and most of the time they'll do like cognitive behavior therapy. Some of the other approaches don't seem to be as successful. There are your criteria for different sort of eating disorders, right? These are not necessarily DSM. What are they on now? 5? You don't know. You should know. Casey,
It's fine,
that's
yeah.
embarrassing.
It's fine.
You need to go upstairs to your
I need
office,
to go get my Bible. Yeah, check it.
figure it out. But these are the different criteria. Again, no worries about this for the exam. But here's some definite brain structure changes for folks. This person has anorexia nervosa, and here is a person that does not have an eating disorder. You can see the enlarged ventricles in the individual with the eating disorder, and sort of larger sulci here because there's some shrinkage of their cortical brain mass. Yeah, glucose. I mean, because again, all of your cells in your brain only runs on glucose, and if you're not eating, you're not getting those nutrients. You're not going to be able to continue that normal brain function and structure. So there you go. Problems both ways. Typically, everybody loves to talk about obesity, but nobody likes to talk about eating disorders, right? It's two sides of the same coin. Problem is you gotta ride right down the middle of that coin, right? And that's a tough balancing act.
Anorexia is just very scary, I think, for a lot of people because it has such high rates of suicide.
Yeah.
So, so that's generally, I feel, why most people avoid it, because it is so debilitating.
Yeah. It's not really ending on a high note, is it?
What is it?
So I said it's not really the way to end on a high note. Like, hey folks, what about that anorexia? Nobody gets too geared up about that. But things you guys need to know about, things you need to watch out for if you think you or someone you know is dealing with an eating disorder. Please take appropriate steps to try to help yourself and help them. Don't be an annoyance to them. That's just going to turn them off. But be supportive, right? I think a lot of this should come from, everybody's gonna fall out somewhere else, right? Everybody's got different body types, and I think a lot of it's just accepting people for who they are, for whatever. My concern with body weight is more health related, right? Are you having some cardiovascular problems? Do you have diabetes? Probably ought to do something about that. If not, buy bigger pants. I don't know, right? It's just not really a big deal. If you're thinner, if you're having some health problems, do something about it. If not, get a belt. That's really just the way it works out. So just go with what you got, but you got to watch those other sort of issues and make sure that you're doing what you need to do to take care of yourself. Questions, comments, concerns? I had some intention of trying to start the